Serious nurses of Reddit, what are some of the most memorable deathbed confessions you've had a patient give? My dad loves small town auctions, and over the years he collected all those boxes of stuff that would go for the lowest bid. He amassed quite a collection, filling the garage and a workshop out back. He always promised mom he'd sell it all someday in some big garage sale or auction of his own. Then one day my mom's cancer returned, and the doctors told us this time it wasn't a fair fight. 2 weeks before she passed, I was sitting with her in the hospital. We'd run out of things to say. She looked up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the pain, and said, "Thank God, at least I won't have to deal with your dad's stuff." Me and mom burst out laughing. Don't tell my dad. Kind of similar, I suppose. I'm a scrub nurse. My job is to assist the surgeon during surgeries. I was preparing an elderly patient for a pretty high-risk surgery. There was a good chance he was going to be fine, but there was also a decent chance things were going to go south. He knew this. While the CRNA is doing her thing getting the anesthesia ready, I'm standing next to him going over his chart and signed releases, and he says to me, "I need you to tell my wife I'm sorry for all the times I raised my voice at her." There weren't many times, but right now I wish there weren't any. That was the first time I ever got choked up at the bedside. Thank goodness for masks because it helped hide my expression. I so badly wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but no one knew if it was going to be. I said back to him, "I'll do anything you need me to, but right now let's think about some happy memories. Before you go under." I asked him to tell me about he and his wife's first date. Once he was under, I excused myself before scrubbing in to stop myself from crying. He made it through surgery and his wife was waiting for him after being transferred from the PACU. This was a couple years back when I was doing a night shift rotation. Maybe not quite the confession you were thinking, but it still breaks my heart to this day. Had a patient one night, perfectly fine. Came back the next night and found out they had a massive stroke mid-morning. Family had decided against surgery due to age factors and other things. Wife was telling me they had a good life together, about 40 to 50 years of being married, kept vigil at the bedside all night, holding their hand. All the kids and grandkids were there too. I told them, although patient was unconscious, they could still hear, so encourage the family to keep talking to them. Tell them everything they want to say before it's too late. Around 4 AM. I could tell the patient was close to the end. Their breathing changes, and the wife asked me if it was time. I gave her an honest answer and she became hysterical, clutching the patient's hand. She kept crying that she wasn't ready to say goodbye. She had so many other plans for them to live out that she didn't want them to die. She wanted them continue living. She wished she hadn't withdrawn treatment so they could have more time together. Patient passed away 15 minutes later. It's been years, but that still stands out to me as one of the most heartbreaking death moments. My dad had a severe stroke last year and the doctor told us that he would never regain consciousness. My parents had a private conversation with each other saying that if they were ended catatonic with no hope of recovery, they wouldn't want their life to be artificially extended. My dad was kept on the ventilator for a total of 2.5 weeks. My mom knew what decision she had to make, but she managed out it off for an additional 3 to 4 days. She knew what to do, but kept wanting to hold on to my dad. Watching my dad physically worsen over time was utterly heart-wrenching, and in the end, we didn't want him to suffer anymore despite having difficulty letting go. Your story reminded me of when we finally took my dad off the ventilator, and how we held his hands and talked to him during his last moments. The thing about death is that there will never be a time when you feel that a person has lived enough. I recently cared for a woman who had multiple acute strokes in a short amount of time. A week before, she had been independent, riding her horse every day, still teaching part-time at the local school. Despite being in her 80s, by the time she got to me, she was completely nonverbal, incontinent, and unable to feed herself. I had a feeling that she was neurologically intact enough to understand what was going on, so I talked to her as much as I could. When I was in the room, talked to her about her daughters, who had called every day, her husband, who hadn't called, but I left that part out, the weather, her horses, her students who had sent a card on the last day of my work week, her daughter from out of state had finally found a flight up. They sat in silence and held hands for hours. Visiting hours ended right at shift change, so I walked in to give report as the daughter was saying goodbye. The patient then spoke what I knew were going to be her last words: "I'll always be looking after you," and pointed to her daughter and then at me, and then she fell asleep. 2 days later, when I came back to work, I was informed she had passed away in the night. I'm an RN, male and white, and worked with many elderly. I had one 90-plus-year male talk about how he had been a part of the KKK in his youth, and how ashamed he was of taking part in several lynching and other assaults on blacks and even some white Catholics. He'd had several CNAs and patient care techs that were either black or Hispanic, and he was always so polite and sometimes even loving towards them. I could tell how deeply his past haunted him. He asked me not to share this information with any of the staff. The last days, before he became too weak to speak anymore, he asked one of the black RNs I worked with if she forgave him. She did not know what he was asking forgiveness for, but told him she did and helped him get right with Jesus. He passed peacefully. A couple days later, I also had a woman who was 100 plus tells me she had been badly abused by her first husband, but was stuck in the marriage because of the culture at that time. He'd been thrown from a horse that he'd also been very cruel to and kicked several times. She ignored his cries for help and let him die. She said she had never told anyone about it, but she felt guilty for it for over 80 years and could still hear him screaming for help. We talked about it a long time. I was working night shift, and it gave me a chance to spend extra time with some patients. My experience working with people with PTSD helped me to help her to see that she was acting to protect herself and others from him, and responding from a place of natural fear. Before she passed, she told me I had helped her find peace with it. My faith and my own life experience has taught me that people do things in the moment because it is often what they believe they have to do, and not to judge them, but to help them find peace within themselves. Kind of a confession. My grandmother was from Spain. At some point in my life I was like, why don't I know how to speak Spanish? So I asked my mom, as I've never heard her speak Spanish either. She said, my mom came to America and was one of the "we are in America now, so we speak English now" people. When we started pestering her to teach us Spanish, she claimed that she forgot how to speak it. We all kind of thought she was full of but she was adamant about it. She was sharp as a tack until her mid-90s and lived alone. Finally, it was too much, and we moved her to our house and then to assisted living because she wanted to be closer to her friends. When she ended up in a nursing home because she was on her last legs and her mind started to go, we caught her speaking Spanish to the mostly Hispanic staff. Basically, she had to go senile to forget that she told us that she couldn't speak Spanish. It was an unintentional confession that she always knew how to speak Spanish, but she just didn't want to because it wasn't the American thing to do. My first year as a nurse, I worked in palliative care. Had a 28-year-old dying of cancer. She moved here from Canada to be with her boyfriend who left her a year after moving. We weren't expecting her to deteriorate so fast. I held her hand as she died alone without her family or friends. But right before she died, she told me she wished she never left Canada and cried. Her family were overseas and couldn't make it in time. It's memorable to me because it reminds me to tell my family I love them regularly and to spend time with friends and to stop making excuses. My wife has 6 older brothers. She was the last offspring of an extremely abusive father, and as a girl was always outcasted even by her brothers, who are sons of a different mother than hers. She severed ties with the father right before we met each other and had been trying to get her mom out of that abusive relationship. The brothers were trying to be a family together and even started inviting her to meetings and stuff, but the scars were too deep. Quite literally, the father was depressed, in his 60s, and tried suicide twice. Both time my wife was the only relative that went to the hospital, pretty much cause she was the only one whose number he knew. It effing destroyed her for weeks after. Then one day the father had a heart attack. He survived, but was in pretty bad shape alone in a hospital bed. My wife called the brothers and the 7 of them decided that he would heap what he sowed and refused to go to the hospital. She was in therapy for months before, and I've never seen her with such a strong resolve. He died a couple days later. She asked for me to deal with the body. A clerk in the hospital told me that day that the whole staff was talking about the man Dad was crying hours before a second, deadly, heart attack and desperately asking why did none of my kids show up? Where are my sons and daughter? I spent like 30 hours freaking out about if I should tell my wife about that. I decided to tell. She made a face that was like held my hand, and said finally some closure, and proceeded to call each brother and tell them, I tell you not. The woman went through serious shit in her life and Nell's dream about being as tough as she is.